And the Son, as it ascends into the sky, it is reborn. God sends his Son, S-O-N, as a sign of his love and his affirmation of everything that is good and noble and decent in the world. When the Catholic Church came along in Italy, the Romans and others didn't want to give up their holidays, so they said, okay, we'll Christianize it. And so they said, okay, we'll say the birth of Jesus was the 25th of December. All this business about mistletoe, pagan. Christmas trees, pagan. Giving out gifts, pagan. Every bit of it is pagan. So we have time, we celebrate for Jesus. Everybody gets all misty-eyed. But the truth is, they're all pagan. But the birth of
Jesus. But the intent of the heart is what it's about.
Exactly. My best Christmas, all of my life, was spent in Jerusalem.
As you saw in the previous video, Revelation chapter 11 verse 10 records that the coming institutionalization of greetings of Mary and gift-giving were the work of the beast, and his victory over the two witnesses, which we know today as the Protestant Reformation. Counter-Reformationists cannot tell the truth about either the book of Revelation or the celebration of Christmas. Because, as you can imagine, if they got up and told everyone in their congregations that they were worshiping the image, or icon, of the beast on December 25th, a lot of people would not be able to live with themselves and continue to do Christmas. So the numerous lies are considered necessary to keep promoting the restoration of the Roman Empire, including its worship of the beast, among these Protestant religious groups, who in reality, honestly, should know much better. And as pointed out previously, in numerous videos, the lying that the Counter-Reformation engages in is not simply limited to the texts of the scriptures, which they do intentionally and incessantly lie about, but they extend their lying all the way across history as well. Lying is an accepted practice among Counter-Reformationists. Not only do they think worshipping the Antichrist is not really a spiritual problem, but they also think that lying to cover it up is also not a problem. Lying for a good cause is not considered a moral evil, but a virtue, and the worship of the Antichrist, according to these people, is a good thing, because Christ and the Antichrist, according to them, are secretly the same thing, despite what it teaches in the New Testament. That is why equating Christ to Apollyon, and then worshipping it, is seen as no problem. They just don't want the public to know that, because they believe the public is simply too stupid to understand their complicated esoteric sophistry in getting your mind that properly twisted. So it is much easier to simply lie.
And the Son, as it ascends into the sky, it is reborn. God sends his Son, S-O-N, as a sign of his love and his affirmation of everything that is good and noble and decent in the world.
The Reformation's witness against Christmas is a major embarrassment to Counter-Reformationists. And yes, there really was a witness in the Reformation against it. They claim Luther loved Christmas and invented Christmas trees. They claim Calvin said it didn't matter, and they claim Spurgeon held evangelism rallies in celebration of it. They do admit the Puritans rejected Christmas, but only because the Puritans were hopelessly stodgy. They dressed only in black and white, and the Puritans hated anything happy, which they referred to as merrymaking. They deny historically that Christians ever had any problem with Christmas. So are these claims true? And if they are not true, then why do these ministers intentionally spread these false claims? Let's begin by picking up where we left off in the previous video, on fact number 2, concerning a unique witness in history. The fact is, the Reformation, along with any form of biblical New Testament Christianity, both before or after, rejected the practice of Christmas. Simply because anyone who can read the New Testament without Pavlovian religious conditioning can easily see, aside from the fact Christmas is a completely pagan practice, the practice itself is unredeemably connected to the Antichrist. And that connection renders Christmas not even an acceptable sin to indulge. When Counter-Reformationists make appeals to their hearts, they are either ignorant of what the scriptures say about the human heart, or they are just downright deceptive about it. But there is not a single instance in the scriptures where the sinful heart of wicked men is a valid excuse for disobeying God, especially concerning the subject of worship. Disobedience to God is evidence in the scripture of a wicked heart. So therefore you cannot justify your sin by appealing to your heart. A wicked heart is what is causing you to justify the sin. If your heart were really right, there would be no need to justify what you are doing by appealing to it. That is a complete contradiction in logic. Test that logic for even one moment. How would you respond to a murderer that says, "I am going to kill you, but it's what's in my heart that counts"? Most people would see how crazy that logic is. If the murderer had anything good in his heart, he wouldn't be murdering you to begin with. So appeals to his heart in order to justify his evil action is hardly a good or valid argument. No, actually it is not what is in your heart that counts. The scriptures say that the wicked boast of their heart's desires, and that the heart is deceitfully wicked above all. Who can know it? And the scriptures also say that all our righteousness is as filthy rags. So it is truly a stupid argument to claim that the wickedness in your deceitful heart somehow justifies your worship of the image of the beast as harmless and spiritually healthy. It is an argument that is so theologically twisted, it should move any biblically literate Protestants to laughter. If it weren't so pitiful. So let's begin our examination of the witness of the Protestant Reformation, a unique witness in history. In the website article you see on your screen, you see the author examines the position of reformers on Christmas. Actually, his article admits more than most. He states that Luther was for Christmas, Zwingli was against Christmas, and Calvin was neither for or against Christmas. And then concludes by noting all three positions are still present in the evangelical community. This author admits more than most do. He admits there was an element within the Reformation that was simply and clearly against Christmas. But he states that Luther was for Christmas and Calvin was neither. That is what most people would consider to be a very neutral and objective presentation concerning the Reformation. But, while there is some truth to that presentation, especially concerning how things eventually ended up historically, that is actually not the whole story. There is much more to this merely surface diversity of opinion than most people realize. The truth of the matter is that the Reformation as a whole was clearly against Christmas across the board throughout Europe. But two critical moments in history came into the lives of both Luther and Calvin that changed the course of history. And those two moments were not born out of theological conviction, but rather out of compromise and weakness. When people make a religion out of people, rather than out of what God has spoken, they do a great injustice to themselves. There is no greater saint in the Old Testament than King David. He was said to have had a heart for God. And he was anointed by God to be the king of Israel during its golden age. The throne of David was promised an eternal heir, to be filled by the Messiah himself. But David made a rather huge mistake during his lifetime. He committed adultery with Bathsheba, and had her husband killed in battle. God forgave him for this pathetic failure. But that is what he did, nonetheless. No one who understands the scriptures has any problem recognizing David's moral and spiritual failure in those events. And they certainly would never be so incredulous as to make a religion or religious practice out of his failure. Yet, that is precisely what you will find happening over the issue of Christmas among Protestants today, which you will soon see in this video. There are religious traditions in the world that take great pride in their connections to and veneration of the Reformers, Calvin and Luther. That pride is understandable, as these two individuals had been revered by much of Western civilization in the past. But Christians follow Christ. And Christ said this to the Pharisees, in Mark chapter 7 verses 6 through 9. Quote, "He answered and said unto them, Well hath Esaias prophesied of you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honoureth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold to the tradition of men, as the washing of pots and cups, and many other such like things you do. And he said unto them, Full well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your own tradition." End quote. Christ does not excuse invalidating the Word of God in order to keep a tradition invented by men, even if the men who invented it are very esteemed. And it is a deeply ingrained tradition. Christ reduces the problem down to one simple cause. Failure to obey God's word in order to keep a tradition was hypocrisy. And it was a particularly nasty kind of hypocrisy at that. It wasn't hypocrisy that offered God lip service only, but hit a heart that was actually deeply apostate. The refusal to reflect on the very real contradiction created between God's word and religious tradition, and not choosing to side with God's word in that conflict, was evidence of how far that heart, in reality, was from God. It was the heart of a hypocrite. When Christians claim it is what is in the heart that counts, they are not reading the words of Christ. Because Christ never said any such thing. In fact, he said quite the opposite. People who refuse to obey God's word because of their tradition have the wicked heart of a hypocrite. And you have to remember, Christ was using the term hypocrite in the context of the Jewish scriptures in the Old Testament, where the label of hypocrite also implied damnation. So Christ certainly was not affirming to anyone that it was what was in their heart that counted. He was pointing to their heart as the problem. Every year, when Christmas rolls around, you will see people citing Luther and Calvin to justify their unbiblical practice of observing Christmas. But they never bother to give the whole story. When we come to the Reformation, and how some Christians use Calvin and Luther as excuses to keep Christmas, they are not only leaving out the words of Christ himself on that subject, they are also leaving out a whole lot of embarrassing history in order to stake those claims. History in many ways, not much different in nature than David's sin with Bathsheba. There was a consensus among Protestants in the Reformation against Christmas. And when the claim is made otherwise, it is leaving out the rest of the story that put both the sources and reasons for that divergence in a place of question. When Luther is quoted to justify Christmas, they rarely quote the other things that Luther also said. If you are going to make Luther the reference point for your religious beliefs, instead of the scriptures, then why cherry-pick this one item from the grocery list? Luther said many things, most of which Lutherans today will happily ignore. And if you are going to cite Calvin, why would you cite only one instance of Calvin, in a very private compromising situation, and not everything else that Calvin actually said about Christmas, from the pulpit even, in his own sermons? The problem is, there was a unanimous consensus in the Reformation concerning Christmas. Zwingli was not the only one. As you will see, his opinion was actually shared by both Luther and Calvin, until their time of moral failure. Those who appeal to this failure to justify themselves are doing nothing more than anyone else would be doing if they appeal to David's sin with Bathsheba to justify their own adultery. In this section, we will examine the unique witness in history concerning Christmas. This will cover what really happened over the issue of Christmas during the Reformation. First, we will begin by looking at Luther, and then we will look at Calvin. We will also look at Spurgeon, the Puritans, and others. We will answer the claims made by counter-reformationists that the reformers justify their observance of Christmas, despite the warnings you see in the scriptures against it, and specifically, its very identification with the beast, in Revelation chapter 11, verse 10. On your screen, you are looking at some of the most famous Lutheran cathedrals in the world. Of course, as you can see from these photos of Lutheran churches, it is abundantly clear Martin Luther must have loved churches and cathedrals, because there are thousands of them all over the world that bear his name as Lutheran cathedrals. If you look on your screen, this is the actual church cathedral in Wittenberg. He posted his 95 theses on the doors of. These famous cathedrals are being marketed to tourists all over the world to generate tourism for the new papal European Union. And not only did Luther preach his sermons in this cathedral in Wittenberg, he is even buried in the sanctuary of this cathedral, right under the pulpit. And considering all the cathedrals on earth that are built in his name, it is easy to see that Martin Luther absolutely loved these cathedrals. Especially the really big ones, like the one in Wittenberg, in which he is buried. Or, at least, you would think that is the case. That is certainly the impression you would get from Lutheran ministers and theologians who work in these very same cathedrals and show them off to the tourists who pay them entrance fees, who travel the world to actually visit them. But the truth is, none of this has anything to do with Martin Luther. In fact, for the most part, it is actually 180 degrees opposite of Martin Luther's very own personhood and actual historical teachings. But this is a prime example of how the Counter-Reformation actually and literally buries the dead body of Martin Luther under the very thing he preached against. The truth is, he did not love cathedrals at all. He did not even actually particularly like cathedrals at all, even as an idea. Because during his own day, the Vatican was in the process of building some very famous mega cathedrals in Europe. And in order to finance those massive cathedrals, the Vatican was selling something called indulgences. They were certificates, signed by the Pope, that in exchange for a certain amount of money, the Pope would declare you were a departed loved one, saved from purgatory or damnation. It was the granting of eternal life by the papacy, based on payments of money. And Luther absolutely despised this blatant corruption. And he despised it so much that he also had no fondness for cathedrals, which they were being used to pay for. And he wrote over and over and over not only about the farce and con artistry of indulgences, but also about the cathedrals themselves, that money was being stolen to pay for. He put them both in the very same category, a despicable religious scam. Martin Luther was so offended by cathedrals spiritually and theologically, he said this about them. And this is an actual quote of Martin Luther, concerning the building of those very churches, including the ones that today bear his very own name, of Lutheran, on them. The following quotes come from a collection of written sermons. They are arranged in topical order in the book, What Luther Says, A Practical in-Home Anthology for the Active Christian. By Ewald M. Plas, copyright 1959, published by the Lutheran Publishing Company, Concordia Press. 8th printing, 1986. Page 535. Quote, "It is better to give your neighbor a penny than to build St. Peter a church of gold, for the former thing is commended, the latter not." End quote. Here, Luther makes the biblical observation, not one penny was ever commanded to be given to churches or cathedrals in the New Testament. In the next quote, however, he goes much farther than simply state it is a fraudulent misdirection of wealth. This next quote comes from pages 297 and 298. Quote, "He will say on Judgment Day, what you have done for the least of my own, you have done for me. Therefore you dare not boast of your building of churches and masses. What do I care for your altars and your bells? Do you imagine I delight in wood and stone, in ringing and ranting? Is not everything mine to begin with? The heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. Who has commanded you to build churches? I have placed living temples before you. These you should have built up, supported for me, and helped for me. Instead you dealt with other things, tomfooleries that I have not commanded. I do not know you. And to sum up everything, what I have commanded you have not done, and what I do not desire, you have carried out with all diligence. Very well, thank yourself in turn for this. I do not know you, you may seek refuge with the God who commanded you to do such things." End quote. Quote, "I do not know you, you may seek refuge with the God who commanded you to do such things." End quote. He literally says, quote, "I do not know you." End quote. Which is a reference to Matthew 7, where Christ dismisses Christians who call him Lord, into eternal damnation, stating he does not know them, because they would not do the will of his Father in heaven. Does that sound like the words of a man who has thousands of cathedrals all over the world, named after him? And these are Luther's own sermons, which Lutheran ministers in these very same cathedrals named after Luther will never preach from their pulpits. For obvious reasons. This was a constant theme throughout the entire body of his preaching. And while these Catholic Gothic multi-million-dollar monstrosities call themselves Lutheran and evangelical, in reality, they are absolutely neither. Luther himself described his definition of what a real evangelical church should look like, according to the scriptures. And this is what he said about it. Remember, these are Martin Luther's very own words on the subject. Quote, "They should sign their names and meet alone in a house somewhere to pray, to read, to baptize, to receive the sacrament, and to do other Christian works." Here one could set out a brief and neat order, and center everything on the word, prayer and love. End quote. This is Luther's description of a truly evangelical church. Christians in their own home, praying together and learning the scriptures. That was it. No church building or cathedral at all. Instead of building and spreading what Martin Luther defined as the real evangelical church, today's phony counter-Reformation Lutheran ministers will spread the exact opposite of Martin Luther, and then stick his name on it, in an exercise of complete opposite-speak religiosity. They will waste millions of dollars on Catholic Gothic cathedrals, and call them Lutheran and evangelical, when in fact, these lying counter-Reformation false Lutheran ministers know perfectly well Luther himself defined those monstrous Gothic cathedrals as absolutely neither Lutheran or evangelical, much less even Christian. In fact, he described them as an offense to God himself. Yet they will turn right around, and actually bury him right in the very floor of one, and go on to build them all over the planet, and stick his name on them. So you see, when it comes to the issue of cathedrals, counter-Reformationists actually hide what Luther said from the public, and instead build thousands of cathedrals all over the world, and stick his very name on them, while they do it. Yet, it is a complete deception. And they know what they are doing when they do this. But that's not all. Wait until you hear the next lie. Counter-Reformationist clergy who call themselves Lutherans try to tell the public. The next quote is of a Lutheran theologian at the University of Erlangen in 1932. Right around the rise of Hitler in Germany, there was a concerted effort among the German clergy to reconcile or reunite the Protestant Church with the Roman Catholic Church under the Vatican. Precisely as you see being done in America today, by American clergy. And this is Reverend Herman Sass, a theologian professor at the University of Erlangen, explaining why this unification among Lutherans is justified. Quote, "The Lutheran Church has not the lightest theological interest in this antithesis between Catholicism and Protestantism. It does not know to which side it belongs. Lutheran theology differs from Reformed theology in that it lays great emphasis on the fact that the evangelical church is none other than the medieval Catholic Church purged of certain heresies and abuses. The Lutheran theologian acknowledges that belongs to the same visible church to which Thomas Aquinas and Bernard of Clairvaux, Augustine and Tertullian, Athanasius and Irenaeus once belonged. The Orthodox Evangelical Church is the legitimate continuation of the medieval Catholic Church. For the Orthodox Evangelical Church is really identical with the Orthodox Catholic Church of all times." End quote. Really? Luther was not part of the Protestant Reformation? And Lutheranism is identical with the Catholic Church of the Dark Ages, minus indulgences and a few other things, which he doesn't bother to mention? That's an incredible statement coming from a Lutheran, because it is clearly not even Lutheran. But there it is. And it is being quoted today by reunification counter-Reformationists who pose as Lutheran clergy. The statement itself is completely stupid on a number of levels. In fact, it is so stupid, it is hard to believe it's simply a matter of stupidity, as the statement came from a professor of theology, who clearly knows better. And the way it is specifically crafted, makes it clear, he is trying to attach the Lutheranism, and the Lutheran Church to the Roman Empire. Which in fact, it was Lutheranism, historically, that broke it down. A complete and exact opposite of this theologian's stupid statement. And furthermore, the only thing that made the Catholic Church and Catholic Church was its institutionalized definition as the celibate clergy of the Roman Empire, under the rule of the papacy. Lutheran clergy have never been celibate, nor have they ever accepted the Roman Pontifex Maximus as anything other than the Antichrist, which is precisely what Martin Luther called it. But here is this pre-Nazi German theologian telling Lutherans, in reality, they are really, simply medieval Roman Catholics, and not Protestants at all. Which is a complete and utter farce. One that any devout Catholic themselves, would be more than willing and happy, to point out, to such a completely deluded Lutheran. This is what Luther said about the prospect of rejoining that medieval church that this German theologian was recommending to Lutherans. Quote, "Some are of the opinion we should stop deriding the papacy and the hierarchy, since, so they hold, it is evident enough that so many writings, books and tracts containing devastating criticisms, songs, poems and pictures have so disgraced the Pope that people know him well and can never overcome this attack. I do not share their view. On the contrary, as the revelation of John says, chapter 17 verses 1 and 2, we should fill to the full the cup of the red harlot, with whom the kings of the earth have committed, and are still committing, fornication, and we should inflict as much suffering and pain on her as she has enjoyed pleasure and power, until she is trodden underfoot like the mud on the streets. And there is nothing more contemptible on earth than this bloodthirsty Jezebel." End quote. So you can see, the Counter-Reformation has no interest in what Luther said about their cathedrals. It has no interest in what Luther said about the medieval Catholic Church. Luther also called the papacy the Antichrist, and also recommended the banishment of fraternities, which they also completely ignore. So why would they be so concerned about what he did at Christmas? If they can't tell the truth about Luther and cathedrals, or Luther and the medieval Catholic Church, or Luther and the papacy, or Luther and fraternal orders? What do you think they are going to do when it comes to Christmas? Do you think they are going to tell the truth about Luther and Christmas? Well, if you guessed no, then you would be perfectly correct. The next section examines the historical lie they spread, that Luther invented the Christmas tree. One of the things about all lies is that they are intentionally invented to hide the truth. And we will take a look at the truth they are hiding behind that lie, as well. As you just saw previously, Counter-Reformationists in Germany, who infiltrated the Lutheran Church, hide from the public what Luther actually taught about basic ideas in Christianity, and sometimes they intentionally lie about it as well. The previous examples are only 2 examples, from among many, that could be cited, to show how this deviation, back to the Roman Catholic Church, is being perpetrated under the cloak of intentional public deception. Many German Lutherans today are, for the most part, fully converted Catholics, wearing the name Lutheran, waiting to be accepted by the Vatican's papacy, which of course, will never really happen. But in the meantime, the Lutheran Church has been fully strategically neutralized, and theologically spaded, by the Counter-Reformation. So when it comes to the subject of Christmas, the theological and religious paradigm of the Counter-Reformation, which routinely uses intentional public deceit to warp anything in history that gets in its way, has no problem with propagating a complete intentional deception on the Christmas front as well. The intentional nature of this deceit will be illustrated for you again in the following pictures. On your screen, you see 2 pictures of a classic German Christmas tree. German Christmas trees were recognizable in history because Germans decorated their trees with candles. Christmas trees, which were previously known as Yalda trees in ancient Persia, from where the practice originated, were called different things throughout Europe. The solstice practices which incorporated them varied from country to country. And this assimilation from paganism occurred long before Martin Luther was ever born. In most practices, the tree was decorated with fruit or flowers. But in Germany, the Germans adopted the practice of decorating the Yalda tree with candles, which, as you can imagine, probably led to a lot of house fires. Thus why lighting the tree with candles was not a widespread practice. It was rather unique to Germany. Until the invention of Mazda lights by General Electric in the early 1900s. GE called the very first production of electric Christmas tree lights Mazda lights, after the Persian god of light, Ahura Mazda, because the people at GE in the early 1900s knew precisely where this practice had actually originated in history. No one was trying to hide its origins at that time in history. Its origin in ancient Persia was fully known and celebrated. Thus the name Mazda lights, for what would later be changed to the name we have today, Christmas tree lights. In the first picture, Luther is shown singing to the classical German Christmas tree, lit up by candles. The picture is shown to illustrate that he invented the Christmas tree because he loved Christmas so much. It is intended to be reassuring to Lutherans that Christmas observance had the full intent and blessing of Martin Luther himself, and all is Reformation. In the second picture, however, you see the same German Christmas tree. Only instead of being decorated with candles, the candles are replaced with snakes. And what is lighting them up is that they are being struck by little lightning bolts, which the artist labeled in the top right-hand corner, the Word of God. And instead of Martin Luther singing to it, you see the title of Antichrist placed at the top of it, flanked by more detailed references to texts in the New Testament, which we will look at in a moment. There is no way to reconcile or explain away these two very contrasting pictures of the German Christmas tree. One depicts Luther enjoying it with adoration and even singing to it. The other depicts it as an object of the Antichrist. What is ironic about these two pictures is that it is openly claimed both of these pictures come from the same theological source and even from the same historical period in Europe. But as you can see, they have nothing even remotely in common. They are complete and polar opposites. So we see from these two very different pictures that someone is simply lying about history. So, who is it, and why are they lying? The first picture of Luther adoring the Christmas tree is cited all over the internet today by counter-Reformation, religious right, Christmas crusader propagandists to show that Luther loved Christmas. Christmas is Christian, and there is nothing wrong with Christmas. Even Martin Luther sang songs of adoration to his Christmas tree, which he invented for Christmas. As you will see in a moment, this is truly an amazingly incredible claim, especially for anyone who spends any amount of honest time on this subject, researching it. Because if you do, you will find some absolutely amazingly brazen, false claims being made. And they are so false and so brazen that it is virtually impossible not to conclude there is fully intentional deceit driving these claims. As you see in the website article shown on your screen, the webpage is published by the famous prophecy expert and internet apologist celebrity Chris D. Putnam of Logos Apologia. The article is entitled, quote, "Christmas trees are not pagan," end quote. He states in his article, quote, "The modern tree began in 16th century Germany. The best evidence points to Martin Luther for popularizing the candlelit evergreen tree. As the Reformation spread, so did Luther's legacy. A popular artist, Karl Schwartzberth, painted a scene of Luther's family around a candlelit tree." End quote. Chris Putnam has all kinds of resume goodies listed on website, including memberships in several Christian societies, and including even something called the Tau Sigma, National Honor Society. That all sounds very impressive. So one would assume he certainly knows what he is talking about. Or so it would seem. After the above quote, Chris Putnam then explains where this picture actually comes from, that he has shown on his website, illustrating Luther singing to his newly invented Christmas tree. He says, quote, "This painting, depicting what oral tradition indicated happened in 1536, was engraved in a gift book, titled Rechieve, from 1853, that was published in Philadelphia. It also said that Luther was the first to light a tree with candles in order to illustrate the light of God to his children." End quote. So his proof that Luther did all this was an illustration produced in 1853, 317 years later, on an entire continent and 4,000 miles away, in Philadelphia. And the reason it is accurate to 1536 is because of oral tradition, that this is what actually happened in history. Oral tradition means there is nothing written to document that such was the case. Someone, along the way in the course of time, simply said it was. Like, for example, George Washington cut down a cherry tree. Or that Ponce de Leon discovered the Fountain of Youth in St. Augustine, Florida. Or that Easter eggs came from a miracle involving Mary Magdalene when she visited Rome, and the egg in her hand miraculously changed to the color red. Or that the Cave of the Seven Sleepers was the location of 7 saints who fell asleep for 70 years and woke up to miraculously convert all the pagans. Those are oral traditions. And Chris Putnam fully knows what he is appealing to when he makes those appeals to what he is calling oral tradition. But there it is. On the other hand, he completely intentionally ignores the picture on the left hand of your screen. Not only does he ignore it, he will not even mention it. As all the other Christmas apologists do, as well. because that is information that simply doesn't fit their political narrative. And counter-reformationists are much more concerned about controlling and manipulating your political and economic behavior than they are with any truth. Truth is something they really don't care that much about at all, unless it just randomly happens to favor their point of view. Then and only then will they even pretend they care about it. And thus, according to Chris Putnam, appeals to a make-believe oral tradition from 1853 in Philadelphia are perfectly fine. That is all the proof you need. Which is none. Just accept it, because it is what we want you to believe. In contrast to Chris Putnam's illustration, created in 1853, 317 years later, in Philadelphia, on a continent 4,000 miles away, across an ocean, Chris Putnam ignores an illustration of the same German Christmas tree, from the Netherlands, in the 16th century, from the time of Martin Luther. As you can see on your screen, the Netherlands is literally right next door to Germany. The distance between the Netherlands and Germany is 0. So let's talk about what that illustration shows, that actually comes from Luther's own time, and from Luther's own region of Europe. First, let's note that it is a satirical picture, which was an art form that was commonly used during the Reformation. Luther's personal friend and artist, Lucas Cranach, was in part responsible for popularizing satirical art to illustrate many theological truths of the Reformation. And instead of the Norman Rockwell-style illustration from the 1800s in Philadelphia, we see the satirical art of the Reformation. And we see it showing the classic German Christmas tree with candles, only instead of candles, it has placed in their stead snakes. The snakes are lit up as they are being struck by lightning from the top left corner, labeled the Word of God. On the left column, there is a quote referencing Daniel chapter 7 verse 25, quote, "He shall speak against the Most High and attempt to change time and law." End quote. That of course is a prophetic text many applied to the Antichrist. And on the right-hand column, there is a reference to Revelation chapter 17 verse 5, quote, "The great Babylon, mother of prostitutes, and of abominations of the earth." End quote. Showing that Christmas was both the changing of the calendar and law associated with the Antichrist, and that it was an abomination of religious prostitution as well. But that's not all. At the top of the tree, the caption reads, "Den Antichrist sit in den Tempel Gods," which is Old Dutch for, "The Antichrist sits in God's temple," showing the tree itself as the symbol of the throne of the Antichrist. So, which of these two opposite pictures do you really think comes from the real history of Luther's actual, real Reformation? The one on the right of your screen, showing Luther singing to a Christmas tree, which he has invented, created 4,000 miles and a continent away, over 300 years later, in Philadelphia? Or the satirical illustration, engraving from the 1500s, in Europe, during the Reformation, right across the border, from Luther's Germany? Let's compare the credibility of these two sources. The first comparison is geographical. Luther singing to the tree was created in Philadelphia. The tree crown with the Antichrist was created in the Netherlands. As you see on the first map, Philadelphia is 4,000 miles away, on another continent, across an ocean. The Netherlands actually borders Germany. So the distance between the two is 0. Based on geography, the second picture certainly takes precedent over the first. The second rubric of measurement is time. The first picture of Luther singing to his German Christmas tree was created in 1853. The second picture of the German Christmas tree crown with the Antichrist was created in the 1500s. Within no more than a few decades, 10 to 20 years, of Luther's actual life. So on the second rubric, the second picture would certainly take precedent. The third rubric is sourcing. The first picture of Martin Luther singing to his Christmas tree comes from what Chris Putnam calls oral tradition. But the second composition, because it was produced during the period of history under question, is actually considered primary source documentation. So on the third rubric, once again, there is no comparison. Yet, despite these facts, it is the second picture apologists, like Chris Putnam, will intentionally ignore and even hide from his audiences. If Chris Putnam had bothered to spend 10 minutes on the internet, Looking into this alleged oral tradition that he claims was so accurate, he would have discovered even Lutherans themselves have openly admitted that the claim Luther had anything to do with Christmas trees in Germany is pure legend and make-believe. There is no basis for it in any historical documentation. And what there is found in historical documentation is quite to the contrary concerning Luther. And that narrative they do not bother telling their audiences about at all. Dr. Richard Butcher, a Lutheran academic scholar and pastor, graduated from Concordia Theological Seminary in 1985 and from Boston University with a doctorate of theology in 2003. He has served as a Lutheran pastor for 20 years and as an adjunct professor at Concordia Seminary. He is the author of The Ecumenical Luther, published by Concordia Publishing House, which is a Lutheran publishing company. Dr. R.P. Butcher stated, concerning this claim about Martin Luther, quote, "As much as I would like to embrace the oft-quoted story that Martin Luther was the first to set up a Christmas tree, or at least lighted one, I cannot. For the story is pure legend. Many years of intensive Luther scholarship has turned up nothing to support it." End quote. Quote, "It is pure legend." End quote. When Chris Putnam created his webpage to claim Luther invented Christmas trees and used an illustration from Philadelphia in 1853, he was most likely fully aware of what Dr. Richard Butcher and other Lutherans had found on this claim, that it was, quote, "pure legend," end quote. But Chris Putnam put that false information forward to the public as the historical truth anyway. Because the error, the disinformation, the mythology, the lie, served his political agenda better than the truth. And that is very common, standard behavior among many counter-Reformationist theologians. Especially those like Chris Putnam. They see no problem in spreading blatantly known religious lies that benefit their political or economic ambitions whatsoever. There is simply no conscience about it. It is also reported on Christian discussion boards and forums on the internet that Chris Putnam was very aggressive and hostile, verging on violent, toward people he disagreed with on those boards. And those defending him often displayed the same kind of violent aggression and engaged in obscene and profane attacks and insults and profanity, even when posting in these Christian forums and discussion boards. Last year, only 4 years after posting this webpage, claiming Luther invented Christmas trees, Chris Putnam died suddenly and unexpectedly, of unspecified causes, at the age of only 51. Some of his critics openly voiced they suspected a link between the spiritual life and ministry and this sudden passing. Chris Putnam, as an apologist for the political religious right, was suppressing a tremendous amount of information to make the claims that he did on his website concerning Christmas. Not only did he know that the story that Martin Luther had anything to do with Christmas trees was pure legend or make-believe, which he preferred to hide under the label of oral tradition. He also knew that there is documentation concerning Luther and Christmas, which is very unflattering to Christmas, which he conveniently left out of his explanations to his audiences. Not only does Chris Putnam's Lutheran Christmas fairy tale turn out to be a work of complete fiction, the actual real truth of the matter historically is not the first picture on the left-hand side of your screen. It turns out that it is the picture on the right-hand side of your screen, which is the truth. Not the one of Luther singing to the Christmas tree at all, but the complete opposite one. The one that associates it with the Antichrist, condemned by Luther's real German Reformation, is documented by primary sources in Luther's own time, in Luther's own region of the world, which we will now look at next. There is a lot of very contradictory information available on Martin Luther and Christmas, as you will see very clearly in a few minutes. Since both kinds of information exist, it is easy to pick the column of information you prefer, whether it be for Christmas or against Christmas, and simply ignore the rest. But between these two columns of information, there is not an equal comparison. And the reason you have contradictory information is not because of what Luther said, but because of what Luther did. What he said is one column. It is consistent, and it is clear, and it is first-hand, from Luther's own thoughts and words and writings. The other column consists of what Luther did. The meaning of the second column of information is explained primarily from second-hand sources, claiming to have seen or witnessed what he did. Between these two columns of information, it is the column of information that represents what Luther actually said and wrote himself, which has priority, historically. What second-hand sources claim they saw someone do, does not take priority over what was said and written by the person themselves, in historical research. But that doesn't mean that the second column of information should simply be ignored, either. An accurate presentation of history takes into account the whole story. And the whole story gives us two opposite claims that openly contradict each other. So let's fully examine that contradiction, and figure out what caused it historically, or at least what is causing it today. As you see on your screen, here is an example of a book for sale. It is entitled, Through the Year with Martin Luther, a selection of sermons celebrating the feasts and seasons of the Christian year. So according to the title of this book, Martin Luther celebrated all the feasts and seasons of the Catholic Church calendar. And he had fun doing it. Personally offering sermons for each event. Here, this website also lists the sermons of Martin Luther, based on the liturgical church calendar. Once again, it gives the impression that Martin Luther endorsed the entire Roman Catholic liturgical church calendar, from Christmas to Lent. It even lists the sermons he preached to celebrate those days, including even his sermon on Lent. And you can even buy books that specifically catalog his Christmas sermons. Like this one you see on your screen entitled, Luther's Christmas Sermons. It is very clear from Lutheran publishing companies and the internet, Luther was a very happy Catholic in a medieval Catholic Church, celebrating all the Roman Catholic calendar days of the Roman Catholic liturgical year. And that's the truth, according to these mainline denominational sources, publishing companies, and theologically educated professionals. Luther, according to them, is now the perfect symbol of ecumenical unity with the papacy and the Catholic Church. And there is nothing about this claim that is either anti-historical or fiction, or so they would have you believe. But is that really the truth? You have already seen that the pictures used by Christmas apologists showing Luther singing to his lighted Christmas tree are simply fabrications. But what about all these church calendars, including even Christmas and Lent, with Luther's sermons? Let's go back to these publishing and internet presentations, and take a little closer look at what we are actually looking at, and being shown, concerning Luther, in some of these books and websites. The first book entitled, Through the Year with Martin Luther, a selection of sermons celebrating the feasts and seasons of the Church. If you bother to look a little closer, and actually read the description of the book, by the author, the description says, quote, "In this volume the reader will find 50 of Martin Luther's most significant sermons, selected and organized, with the lay reader in mind." End quote. So in other words, this is not Martin Luther preaching through the liturgical year, celebrating each of its feasts and seasons. That is what the author is doing. And the author has simply selected, and then personally organized, the sermons of Martin Luther, to match the liturgical calendar. So the title is a little misleading. The second example of the website, that lists the sermons of Martin Luther, through the liturgical calendar including both Christmas and Lent, is interesting too, because it is by the same Lutheran academic Richard Butcher, mentioned earlier, concerning the fiction of the Christmas tree. Here he shows Luther's sermons again, according to the Roman Catholic liturgical calendar. But what is odd, is that if, for example, you actually look up the Sermon on Lent, this is an excerpt of what you will actually read Luther preaching, in that Sermon on Lent, quote, "Lent has become a mere mockery because our fasting is a perversion and an institution of man. But worst of all is that we have adopted and practiced fasting as a good work, as a meritorious work before God, to atone for our sins and obtain grace. And it is this that has made our fasting a stench and so blasphemous and shameful, so that no drinking and eating, no gluttony and drunkenness, could have been as bad and foul. It would have been better had people been drunk day and night than to fast thus. I will not mention the many other evils as the consequences, as that pregnant mothers, and their offspring, the sick and the weak, were thereby ruined, so that it might be called a fasting of Satan, instead of a fasting unto holiness." End quote. He says Lent is a commandment of men, a perversion, a stench, a meritorious work that is blasphemous to God. It causes pregnant mothers to harm their offspring during their pregnancies, and threatens the life and health of the weak and sick. And if that were not all bad enough already, he calls Lent a fasting of Satan. That's hardly a full-throated endorsement and celebration of Lent. Yet there it is on the Roman Catholic liturgical calendar, as though he were completely endorsing the actual celebration of the Roman Catholic Lent. Yet in that very sermon, he calls it a work of Satan, and an invention of men. What on earth is going on here? Obviously, if he were celebrating the feasts and seasons of the Church, as the title implied on the book you just saw previously, you wouldn't be reading sermons from Martin Luther, calling Lent the work of Satan. Would you? So this would be easy to dismiss, as an optical manipulation of Luther's material, to get to an exact opposite conclusion of what really existed historically. Yet, why was he preaching at Lent, while at the same time condemning it? That is the historical contradiction we mentioned earlier, that created those two opposite columns of information, which we will look at next. Why was Luther preaching during Lent, and at the same time openly condemning it? There are two parts to the answer of what is creating the confusion and contradiction over Luther and Christmas. The first part is much different than the second part, but both are responsible for adding to the contradiction. The first part of the answer to that question is illustrated in this following example. Anyone familiar with current events knows our current president is not famous for being an advocate of multiculturalism. The very suggestion would generate a response of laughter from both supporters and critics of the president, because it is both widely and commonly known he openly states political correctness and multiculturalism to be his enemy. He not only has no interest in it, he openly attacks it. But let's say 500 years from now, people in academic institutions want the public to see Donald Trump as a multiculturalist, despite what he was in real history. And let's say they wanted to emphasize his closeness to Native American Indians. So, they might produce something like you are seeing done today with Martin Luther. They might produce a calendar of Native American holidays and tweets by Donald Trump on those very days, showing Donald Trump celebrating the Native American holidays. Here are some Native American holy days. And what follows is Donald Trump's celebration of each holy day in an address to the nation by tweets. The first holy day is the Iroquois celebration of midwinter. And as you can see, Donald Trump clearly celebrated that day by tweeting to the nation about reflection. The second holy day is the Navajo celebration of the end of winter on March 12th. Here, Donald Trump is celebrating the Navajo date by addressing the nation on being watchful. The third Native American holy day is the celebration of the bear dance by the Utes on June 1st. On this day, Donald Trump celebrates with the Utes by tweeting about wisdom. The fourth Native American holy day is the Lakota Sun Dance on June 21st. And on June 21st, Donald Trump tweets to the nation about security. And finally, the fifth example is Donald Trump's celebration of the Native American Holy Day of Soil on December 22nd with the Hopi Indians, where he addresses the nation about strength in celebration of soil. There is the Native American calendar with all of Donald Trump's tweets celebrating it. Tweets Donald Trump personally gave on those very days. Everything you are seeing in those dates in Donald Trump's tweets is actually true. But it is also leading the reader to a very false conclusion. 500 years from now, people not too familiar with American history might have no clue that not only did Donald Trump have no interest in celebrating Native American holy days, he tweeted almost every other day, so it would be very easy to find a tweet on a Native American holy day. What the person in the future might not know is that Donald Trump notoriously tweeted every other day, no matter what day it was. Arranging his tweets on a calendar of Native American holy days would be misleading, especially if they thought his tweets on those days was evidence he was celebrating those Native American holy days. Let's illustrate this technique again. Here is a calendar of Russian Bolshevik secular state holy days. And we are going to show Martin Luther celebrating the Russian Revolution with the Bolsheviks hundreds of years before it happened. Here is the list of their holy days. And here is Martin Luther preaching on those days. See, Martin Luther was a Russian Bolshevik. And Donald Trump celebrated Native American holy days. So when you see arrangements of Martin Luther's sermons on the Catholic liturgical calendar, that really doesn't prove anything historically, one way or another. Martin Luther preached 7,000 sermons in his lifetime. According to this article by R.C. Sproul, he preached on average every other day. Just about as much as Donald Trump tweets. So finding a sermon that Martin Luther preached on those liturgical calendar days would be fairly easy to do. There were plenty to pick from. But that really doesn't mean anything on its own, despite the illusion it creates in the public mind. It is true that Martin Luther did preach during Christmas services at the Wittenberg Cathedral. And he did preach on Lent. But the content of what he actually said about Lent and Christmas is more important than the fact he said it at these times. When else would be more appropriate to condemn or criticize them than at the time they were being done? But the fact he was preaching against them at the same time they were being held is part of the historical contradiction that is used to intentionally confuse modern audiences, and that creates the two columns of information that contradict each other. But rather than simply pick a column and ignore the other, let's continue to try and figure out what really happened. Calendars which show Luther's sermons arranged on Catholic holy days, however, is not really going to do anything to solve that contradiction. It will only muddy the waters. Why? Because Luther preached almost daily. And because of the second issue in the answer to that question, we will now examine. Richard Butcher shows a number of sermons on one of his websites that Luther preached during the Christmas season of 1522. Between all the sermons listed, Luther refers to the word Christmas 7 times. It's clearly referenced in the texts of his sermons. So it appears that Luther is giving his endorsement of Christmas in his sermons in 1522 AD. And those sermons are listed with the liturgical calendar as a presentation of the real Luther on the subject of Christmas, showing that he both endorsed it and even celebrated it. However, the people creating these calendar displays of Luther's Christmas sermons are also aware of some other information that they intentionally hide. And it is the other information that puts those liturgical calendars in historical context. If you were to see Luther's 1522 Christmas sermons and conclude Luther was therefore endorsing Christmas, you would have come to precisely the wrong conclusion. The problem with that conclusion is that just 2 years earlier, in 1520, Luther had stated in an open public letter to the entire German nation, addressed to the German nobility, the following, quote, "All festivals should be abolished, and the Lord's Day alone retained. Here is the reason: since the feast days are abused by drinking, gambling, loafing, and all manner of sin, we anger God more on holy days than we do on other days. Things are so topsy-turvy that holy days are not holy, but working days are. Nor is any service rendered to God and his saints by so many saints' days. On the contrary, they are dishonored." End quote. So we see Luther call for an abolishment of Christmas in 1520 AD. And then we see his Christmas sermons in 1522 AD, 2 years later. That is an obvious historical contradiction. But that is not the only statement he made concerning Christmas in 1520. This next quote comes from Luther's writing entitled, A Treatise on Good Works, also written in 1520 AD again, 2 years earlier. Quote, "And would to God that in Christendom there were no holiday except the Lord's Day, that the festivals of Our Lady and of the saints were all transferred to the Lord's Day. Then would many evil vices be done away with through the labor of the workdays, and lands would not be so drained and impoverished. But now we are plagued with many holidays, to the destruction of souls, bodies and goods. Of which matter, much might be said." End quote. These two published written works by Luther, and his statement on Rome's holy days, and its entire liturgical calendar, was being distributed all across Northern Europe by the time he was preaching those Christmas sermons in 1522. what was happening at this time in history that explained this very odd contradiction? The answer is that while Luther had called for an abolition of the Roman Catholic liturgical calendar, including all its feast and fast days, from Christmas to Lent, the German Church he preached in, under the control of Frederick III, had not implemented those reforms. And Luther was still preaching, as a preacher, in that still Catholic, unreformed, German Church. At the same time his calls for reform were being spread throughout all of Europe, including in cities that would become Protestant Europe. From Zurich, to Geneva, to Stockholm, to Helsinki, entire cities were receiving his writings, and beginning to discontinue the observance of Christmas across Northern Europe and Scandinavia. Luther was a clergyman employed by the German Church. And it was a German Church that had not implemented his recommendations that Roman holy days and its liturgical calendar be abolished. Luther's job as a clergyman was to show up and preach on those liturgical calendar days, which he continued to do, but on public record, against them. So you see, despite the fact that the preacher, Martin Luther, did his job on Christmas for the German Church, he also made it clear, during that very same time in history, that was not the teaching or intent of the scriptures, nor what he endorsed. This is called accommodation. Accommodation means you simply accommodate what you have gone on record being against, but have no way to change what exists. So, you simply accommodate it. And that is what Luther was doing in those Christmas sermons in 1522. While he knew the practice was wrong, according to the New Testament, he was accommodating it through his actions. This is also called, in derogatory terms, compromising. And it was not the first time Luther would do that. Luther's compromises with the unreformed German Church, however, did not constitute his endorsement of those practices. In fact, he had made himself quite clear in published writings, which were going out across Europe, including to the Netherlands, next door. The same Netherlands that produced an image of the German Christmas tree with the title of Antichrist over its top. The Reformation satire concerning the Christmas tree, belonging to the Antichrist, was an accurate portrayal of the consensus of the Reformation during this time. Despite the fact, Luther himself was still required to be preaching Christmas sermons in Germany. Luther also previously preached an indulgence sermon after he had already come to believe indulgences were damnable acts of Simonry. But as a professional preacher, he mounted the pulpit and did his job as the preacher and preached the indulgence sermon anyway. Later, he would cite that very guilt-producing burden that was placed on preachers to preach such blasphemy from their own pulpits as one of the reasons indulgences simply had to be discontinued. It was asking the clergy to preach from their own pulpits damnable lies they knew were not true, for the sake of stealing wealth from the people, for the Vatican and its cathedrals. But this is not all. It is often claimed by counter-reformationists that one simply misunderstands Luther if they cite Luther against Christmas. Luther did not really mean what he said, or it is not meant the way it is being taken that Luther was against Christmas. Because here are all Luther's sermons on Christmas that he did preach. But as you saw earlier, the production of calendars with sermons does not really, honestly, solve the problem for counter-reformationists. In none of the texts from those very sermons is there any open, direct statement or record of Luther ever endorsing the holiday. Not a single endorsement can be cited by them in defense of Christmas. Instead, you will see make-believe pictures and second-hand quotes from other people who claim they saw Luther do Christmas or enjoy it. But there is no statement available to them to quote to that effect directly from Luther. Which is quite odd, seeing that if all that were actually true, such a quote would be easily found. But there is none. He would often endorse the topics or themes associated with the time around Christmas, which were themes common to many parts of the New Testament, but never a direct quote endorsing the Christmas holiday itself. They will show imaginary illustrations, and they will show sermons on calendars, but they can never show a direct quote of Luther endorsing or praising Christmas. Here's what you should understand about the significance of that absent endorsement. They certainly could show such quotes if such quotes actually existed. but they do not show them, because they do not exist. So instead, they show you fake pictures, and arranged calendars, and sermons on them, to make their point, in the absence of any direct endorsements. So in other words, they are misleading their audiences with historical half-truths. And as the saying goes, half-truths are whole lies. Next time you see those Christmas pictures, or sermon calendars, concerning Martin Luther, do one simple thing: make sure and ask them for a direct quote from Martin Luther himself, specifically endorsing Christmas. Not the incarnation, or the advent of Christ, or joy, or happiness, or a generic sentence with the word Christmas in it. But a direct quote, where Martin Luther actually endorses the observance of Christmas. All they will ever be able to produce is Luther talking about some generic point of theology, and at best, using the word Christmas in the text. No direct endorsement will be found. Why? Because not only did Luther openly recommend to the German nobility that these practices be dropped from the German church, he went even much farther than that, to force Germany to act. And not to his credit. And this too, is never mentioned by Christmas apologists, who are more interested in manipulation than the truth. In December 1524, 2 years after the date of the Christmas sermons of 1522, listed on Dr. Butcher's website, Martin Luther himself was accused of actually inciting riots among the youth at the University of Wittenberg. The youth had been intentionally agitated, to the point that they threw bricks through the window of the home of the university's dean. They also gathered outside his home and sang mockeries of the Mass at Christmas. In the book entitled Luther, Volume 2, authored by Hartmann Grisser, professor at the University of Innsbruck, page 330. Quote, "The canons were now tormented by the singing of satires on the Mass outside their house, and had to listen to the curses which were showered on them. One night the dean had his windows smashed. The town council, and also the university, now definitely took sides against the chapter, and, after warning them in writing of God's anger, sent representatives to advise the canons of their excommunication. Although no actual tumult took place, yet the public declarations and the threatening attitude of the populace incited by Luther amounted to practical compulsion. The few canons still remaining finally yielded to force, particularly when they saw that the Elector, Frederick the Wise, refused to give any but evasive replies to their appeals. On Christmas Day, 1524, for the first time, there was no Mass." End quote. Christmas was brought to an end in Wittenberg, by Luther himself, by literally inciting riots against it, at the University of Wittenberg, in 1524. 2 years after his Christmas sermons in 1522. So if you take his sermons in 1522 as evidence he endorsed Christmas, then what he did in 1524 directly refutes that claim. In a rather extreme way. No one would even think of inciting riots against Christmas today, even if they disagreed with it. Yet Luther did precisely that. While at the same time, preaching those very Christmas sermons, held out as his endorsement. So that is quite a contradiction, if there ever was one. And although there are 7 references in his sermons on Christmas in 1522, future references to the word Christmas in his sermons following 1522, for a long period of time, begin to fade and disappear, and would not reappear for several years. Why was this? His close friend and associate, and the man many historians attribute to the actual Reformation of the German Church, was a man by the name of Martin Bucer. Bucer rode on horseback from church to church throughout all of Germany, networking Reformation churches together, in person. Martin Bucer and Martin Luther shared viewpoints on theology, and this is what Martin Bucer had to say about all Rome's holy days, including Christmas. Quote, "That zeal which brought them first in, was without all warrant of the word, and merely followed corrupt reason, forsooth to drive out the holy days of the pagans, as one nail drives out another. These holy days have been so tainted with superstitions that I wonder we tremble not at their very names." End quote. The disappearance of direct references to the word Christmas in his sermons following 1524 was echoed by Martin Bucer's claim that even speaking the names of these festivals should cause one to tremble in fear. That is more than enough historical evidence to show directly from Luther's own writings, and his real actions in history, that he was no fan of either Christmas or Lent or the Roman Catholic liturgical calendar. But that's not all. There's even more. In entry number 667 of Luther's Table Talks, Luther describes the fall of the Kingdom of Bohemia during the Reformation. He describes the causes of that fall in the following way. Quote, "The Emperor Sigismund was, as it were, made captive by the Papists. They made him do what they pleased, to hear a deacon's coat, and, at Christmas, to read the Gospel to the Pope, so that every emperor is now said to be a deacon of the Romish Church, the Pope's mass servant. The Emperor, after he performed this ceremony, had never any success against the Turks or in Germany. The Kingdom of Bohemia is fallen, which before was a very fair kingdom." End quote. Here, you see Luther clearly connect the compulsion of the King of Bohemia, by the Pope, to the reading of the Gospel account of the birth of Christ by the King, to the Pope, on Christmas, as a foreshadowing of the collapse of Bohemia. Martin Luther cites compulsion, Christmas and the papacy, all specifically and overtly by name, in direct connection to one another, as the cause of the fall of that kingdom. Obviously, Luther would not have been capable of such words, actions and opinions, if he had actually loved Christmas, the way Christmas apologists now try to dishonestly claim he did. Luther denounced Christmas, publicly, to the whole realm of Germany in 1520. Luther personally had it banned in Wittenberg, as the result of a riot by university youth he himself had incited in 1524. And in the 1530s, Luther implicated it, in the fall of the Kingdom of Bohemia, in a conversation to an associate clergyman, Nicolaus Medler. So the question is, how did Lutherans end up perpetually observing Christmas today? Lutherans are among some of the greatest militant advocates of Christmas, both in the US and in the world today. And it was a Lutheran president that violated the First Amendment of the Constitution to have it signed into federal law. So what happened? How did Lutherans go from rioting against it in Wittenberg to beating up people that criticize it? How did that happen to Lutherans? Here is where we find Martin Luther's final moral failure. According to many historical scholars on Luther, Luther went through a dark period toward the end of his life. He was fed up with the German nobles, he was angry at the Anabaptists, he was frustrated with the German Papists, and he published a now infamous anti-Semitic screed against the unrepentant Jews. Luther was lashing out in all directions. The Reformation that Luther is erroneously credited with for starting in Germany had more of an impact in other European countries than it did in Germany. In Germany, the Reformation had a popular but shallow commitment. Luther himself stated that even his most ardent supporters were only a few sermons away from returning to popery, and could be easily seduced back into Roman Catholicism with as few as 2 or 3 sermons from Luther, if he were so inclined. After Luther's death, the Reformation in Germany actually completely collapsed. Quote, "After he died, whole regions of Germany fell to the political and military machinery of the papacy and Emperor Charles V. Through the military victories of Charles, Luther's theology became outlawed and Luther's teachings were forbidden in many areas. The Reformation in Germany seemed to be gasping for breath as the Roman Catholic Church regained strongholds." End quote. The country of Germany, including the very institutions and repositories of Luther's own writings, fell into the hands of German Lutheran counter-Reformationists, and have remained there to this very day, as you saw illustrated in the previous quote by the German Lutheran theologian. Over the years, toward the end of Luther's life, in the 1530s and early 1540s, Luther's initial accommodation of Christmas eventually turned into a placid acceptance. But Luther's acceptance of Christmas was not the Christmas we have today. What Luther had accepted about Christmas was not the Mass, the drunkenness, the fornication, the commercialism, Santa Claus or Christmas trees. The only part of Christmas Luther had actually accepted was the belief that Christ had really been born on December 25th. And therefore memorial services, centered around preaching of the Word, about his incarnation, were seemingly appropriate. But that is all Luther actually accepted. And his Christmas sermons, from these years, focus exclusively on these biblical topics. But in moving from accommodation to acceptance, Luther had made a most serious mistake in his thinking. He believed that Rome had told him the truth about the day of the birth of Christ. That it really had been on December 25th. Which Luther, in his sermons, often states, citing the December 25th date of Christmas as the actual day of Christ's birth. Luther felt that as long as the observance had been separated from the Roman Catholic Mass and from its practice of hedonism, there was nothing wrong with remembering the date of his birth in the memorial service which centered on the word and preaching. There were no pagan solstice trees. There were no drunken parties. There was no Santa Claus or apostate pedophile Saint Nicholas. And there was no religious commercialism in Luther's Christmas. There was only the remembrance of the day as the Savior's birth, commemorated by the word and prayer. That was all that Luther ever accepted about Christmas. But even this was a compromise, made in error, based on the mistaken belief that Christ had really been born on December 25th. The problem, of course, was that December 25th was just another life from the Vatican. There was nothing on December 25th to celebrate, because Christ was not born on that day. And so Martin Luther himself accepted this lie into his own church. A lie which was foundational to the very Antichrist he had so virally opposed. That compromise came at the end of his life, after his words of Reformation had already been printed and spread throughout the rest of Europe. By the time Luther had changed his mindset of accommodation of Christmas into a compromised acceptance of it without the Catholic Mass, his abolition against Christmas, in his very own words, had already spread across all of Protestant Europe. And in Protestant cities throughout Europe, Luther's own recommended ban against Christmas had already been implemented as ecclesiastical and civil policy. Luther's words against Christmas were being quoted by Protestants, as Luther himself was actually celebrating it. Luther's compromise not only embarrassed, but undercut and endangered those who had followed his own earlier writings against Christmas. He had effectively pulled the rug out from his own supporters. And as a result of Luther's own hypocrisy on the subject of Christmas, violence broke out between pro-Christmas and anti-Christmas Protestants throughout Reformed Europe, which you will see more about in the next section when we come to Calvin on Christmas. Luther's compromise on Christmas was culminated in a series of sermons entitled Luther's Complete Church Postilles, which was finished in 1544. It was published in 1545. Just a year later, in 1546, Luther died on February 18, 1546. Accounts of the cause of death differed from a heart attack to stroke, similar to the manner of death with John Wycliffe during Wycliffe's last Christmas. Luther died completely deceived about and compromised with Christmas, thinking it really was the day of Christ's birth. And Luther died in the midst of his compromise, contradicting his own words and actions on that very subject. And it was a mistaken compromise, which would give rise to the Christmas militants we have today, who now persecute and intentionally deceive the world in Luther's own name. Christmas militants who were in reality born historically out of the German Counter-Reformation, which had actually collapsed his entire work in Germany after his own death. If Luther had ever come to realize December 25th was nothing more than another Vatican lie to hide its assimilation of paganism, if Luther had ever come to realize that Christmas was actually the prophesied worship of the image of the beast, there is little doubt he would have ended his life's work with the same opinion he had held throughout his earlier years as a true reformer. And there is little doubt he would have remained true to the words of his friend and associate reformer, Martin Bucer, who said that even speaking the word Christmas should cause us all to tremble. But we will never know for sure, because that is not what happened. Here is the truth about Martin Luther and Christmas. When you hear people claim that he loved Christmas so much, he invented Christmas trees for it, that is a lie. He did no such thing. He did, at the end of his life, defeated and depressed, move from a mindset of accommodation of Christmas to acceptance of it, based on his mistaken belief it had really been the day Christ had been born. But the Christmas he had agreed to accommodate and then compromise with was not the Christmas we have today. It was entirely nothing more than an erroneous memorial of Christ's birth on that day, which never happened. But in reality, unknown in the days of Martin Luther, there was really nothing there to ever celebrate. It was entirely Vatican fiction and pagan fable. And his compromise was nothing more than a work of his weary and tired flesh. So that brings us to the question of whether or not it is what is in the heart that counts. You will be told by Christmas propagandists in pulpits all across America and all over the internet today that Luther taught, if it is not directly mentioned in the scripture, then it is simply a matter of personal discretion when it comes to Christmas. But as you are finding out, it is mentioned in scripture numerous times and in some very serious ways, including here in Revelation 11, verse 10, where it beginning to be openly connected to the worship of the image of the beast, which you have already seen in chapters 3 through 9, and will see much more about in the chapters to come. And if you actually read what Luther said himself about worship and the question of whether it is simply a matter of what is in your heart that counts, you will find him say no such thing. Quite to the contrary. This is what Luther said about that when he was still filled with the flames of Reformation. Quote, "This is, in reality, establishing idolatry, undertaking to worship God without God's bidding, on the basis of one's own inclination. For he will not have us direct him how he is to be served. He intends to teach and direct us in this matter. Without his word all is idolatry and lies, however devout it may seem and however beautiful it may appear. For here you learn that it is not enough to say and think, I am doing this for the glory of God, I intend it for the true God, I want to serve the only God. All idolaters say and intend just that. Intentions or thoughts do not count. If they did, those who martyred the apostles and the Christians would also have been God's servants, for they too thought that they were rendering God a service. Rather let each see to it that he is sure that his worship of God is instituted by God's word, and not devised by his own devout inclination or good intention. For whoever is given to a worship of God that lacks the approval of God, should know that he is not serving the true God but an idol of his own invention, that is, his own notion and false idea, and thereby the devil himself. And that the words of all the prophets are against him." End quote. With these words, Luther condemned himself, in the end. Over Christmas, December 25th being, quote, "an idol of his own invention, that is, his own notion and false idea, and thereby the devil himself. And that the words of all the prophets are against him." End quote. Luther, like Samson, died blinded and defeated. But he will be always remembered in history for pulling down the pillars of the pagan temple of the Philistines. But in the end, he too died a blinded and defeated captive. Did Luther ever endorse Christmas? No, he did not. Did he eventually accept church services memorializing December 25th as the date of the incarnation of Christ? Yes, he did. And his acceptance of that claim was a tragic mistake in history. Did he ever accept or endorse our modern Christmas? No, he never did. No trees, no Santas, no commercialism, no St. Nicholas. He did make the mistake of believing in the lie that Christ had been born on December 25th. Everyone today who is educated on the subject and honest can clearly see today with 2020 hindsight, Luther's acceptance of that claim was entirely mistaken historically. And that mistake in the end contradicted his very own warnings against man-made inventions of worship, being the devil. Which, unknown to Luther, it actually was. So citing Luther's historical mistake and personal failure and hypocrisy is no justification to continue in the sin. Even if you are a Lutheran. Quote, "For whoever is given to a worship of God that lacks the approval of God, should know that he is not serving the true God but an idol of his own invention, that is, his own notion and false idea, and thereby the devil himself. And that the words of all the prophets are against him." End quote. And so died Martin Luther. Exactly as he had warned. Deceived into worshiping the devil, and with the words of all the prophets against him. Even though Martin Luther fell away from Reformation truth, at the end of his life, he had in fact birthed a unique historical witness against Christmas, in his own time, and in his own words, which subsequently were spread across Protestant Europe, even as he himself was compromising those very truths back in Germany. And like Martin Luther himself, the German Reformation he was given credit for starting fell away and was overturned. But the Reformation was in reality much bigger than Luther or Germany, and it was begun in Europe long before Luther was ever even born. And it would outlive him. As you saw in the previous video, the greetings of Mary and gift-giving unmistakably point to Christmas, but they had not developed yet in history. At this time, the Reformation was emerging in Europe, and it was bringing an historical witness against Christmas. Just as Martin Luther had issued, in his own writings, at the beginning of his career in 1520. 3 years after his authorship of the 95 Theses. The second figure, which must be examined under the topic of the unique witness in history, will be John Calvin. Just as you saw with Martin Luther, John Calvin too is somewhat misrepresented by counter-Reformation Christmas propagandists. And we will examine that misrepresentation in the next video. Amazingly, you will discover Martin Luther and John Calvin were both unanimous in their opinion of Christmas. It was the worship of Satan. And that shocking truth is what you will discover next. Thank you for watching.